Wind, Sand, and Stars. Chapter 8. Prisoner of the Sand. Part 1. After 3 years of life in the desert, I was transferred out. The fortunes of the air service sent me wandering here and there, until one day I decided to attempt a long-distance flight from Paris to Saigon. When, on December 29th, 1935, I took off, I had no notion that the sands were preparing for me their ultimate and culminating ordeal. This is the story of the Paris to Saigon flight. I paid my final visit to the Weather Bureau, where I found Monsieur Viau stooped over his maps like a medieval alchemist over an alembic. Lucas had come with me, and we stared together at the curving lines marking the new-sprung winds. With their tiny flying arrows, they put me in mind of curving tendrils studded with thorns. All the atmospheric depressions of the world were charted on this enormous map, ochre-colored, like the earth of Asia. "Here is a storm that we'll not hear from before Monday," Monsieur Vieux pointed out. Over Russia and the Scandinavian peninsula, the swirling lines took the form of a coiled demon. Out in Iraq, in the neighborhood of Basra, an imp was whirling. "That fellow worries me a little," said Monsieur Vieux. "Sandstorm, is it?" I was not being idly curious. Day would not yet be breaking when I reached Basra, and I was fearful of flying at night in one of those desert storms that turn the sky into a yellow furnace and wipe out hills, towns, and river banks, drowning earth and sky in one great conflagration. It would be bad enough to fly in daylight through a chaos in which the very elements themselves were indistinguishable. Sandstorm? No, not exactly. So much the better, I said to myself, and I looked round the room. I liked this laboratory atmosphere. Vieux, I felt, was a man escaped from the world. When he came in here and hung up his hat and coat on the peg, he hung up with them all the confusion in which the rest of mankind lived. Family cares, faults of income, concerns of the heart, all that vanished on the threshold of this room, as at the door of a hermit's cell, or an astronomer's tower, or a radio operator's shack. Here was one of those men who are able to lock themselves up in the secrecy of their retreat and hold discourse with the universe. Gently, for he was reflecting, Monsieur Vieux rubbed the palms of his hands together. "No, not a sandstorm. See here." His finger traveled over the map and pointed out why. At 4 in the morning, Lucas shook me into consciousness. "Wake up." And before I could so much as rub my eyes, he was saying, "Look here, at this report. Look at the moon. You won't see much of her tonight. She's new, not very bright, and she'll set at 10 o'clock. And here's something else for you. Sunrise in Greenwich Meridian time, and in local time as well. And here are your maps, with your course, all marked out. And here is your bag, packed for Saigon." My wife broke in. "A razor and a change of shirt. He who would travel happily must travel light." We got into a car and motored out to Le Bourget, while fate, spying in ambush, put the finishing touches to her plans. Those favorable winds that were to wheel in the heavens, that moon that was to sink at 10 o'clock, were so many strategic positions at which fate was assembling her forces. It was cold at the airport and dark. The Simoon was wheeled out of her hangar. I walked around my ship, stroking her wings with the back of my hand in a caress that I believe was love. 8,000 miles I had flown in her, and her engines had not skipped a beat. Not a bolt in her had loosened. This was the marvel that was to save our lives the next night by refusing to be ground to powder on meeting the upsurging earth. Friends had turned up. Every long flight starts in the same atmosphere, and nobody who has experienced it once would ever have it otherwise. The wind, the drizzle at daybreak, the engines purring quietly as they are warmed up, this instrument of conquest gleaming in her fresh coat of dope, all of it goes straight to the heart. Already one has a foretaste of the treasures about to be garnered on the way. The green and brown and yellow lands promised by the maps, the rosary of resounding names that make up the pilot's beads, the hours to be picked up one by one on the eastward flight into the sun. There is a particular flavor about the tiny cabin in which, still only half awake, you stow away your thermos flasks and odd parts and overnight bag, in the fuel tanks heavy with power, and best of all, forward, in the magical instruments set like jewels in their panels, and glimmering like a constellation in the dark of night. The mineral glow of the artificial horizon, these stethoscopes designed to take the heartbeat of the heavens, are things a pilot loves. The cabin of a plane is a world unto itself, and to the pilot it is home. I took off, and though the load of fuel was heavy, I got easily away. I avoided Paris with a jerk and up the Seine at Milan. I found myself flying very low between the showers of rain. Nevers lay below me, and then Lyon. Over the Rhône I was shaken up a bit. Mont Ventoux was Captain Snow. There lies Marianne, and here comes Marseille. The town slipped past as in a dream. I was going so far, or I thought I was going so far, that these wretched little distances were covered before I was aware of it. The minutes were flying. So much the better. There are times when, after a quarter hour of flight, you look at your watch and find that 5 minutes have gone by. Other days when the hands turn a quarter of an hour in the wink of an eye. This was a day when time was flying. A good omen. I started out to sea. Very odd, that little stream of vapor, rising from the fuel gauge on my port wing. It might almost be a plume of smoke. Prévost! My mechanic leaned towards me. Look, isn't that gas? Seems to me it's leaking pretty fast. He had a look and shook his head. Better check our consumption, I said. I wasn't turning back yet. My course was still set for Tunis. I looked round and could see Prévost at the gauge, on the second fuel tank aft. He came forward and said, "You've used up about 50 gallons. Nearly 20 had leaked away in the wind. That was serious. I put back to Marignane, where I drank a cup of coffee, while the time lost hurt like an open wound. Flyers in the Air France service wanted to know whether I was bound for Saigon or Madagascar, and wished me luck. The tank was patched up and refilled, and I took off once more with a full load, again without mishap, despite a bit of rough going over the soggy field. As soon as I reached the sea, I ran into low hanging clouds that forced me down to 60 feet. The driving rain spattered against the windshield, and the sea was churning and foaming. I strained to see ahead and keep from hooking the mast of some ship, while Prévost lit cigarettes for me. Coffee! He vanished into the stern of the cockpit and came back with a thermos flask. I drank. From time to time, I flicked the throttle to keep the engines at exactly 2100 revolutions, and ran my eye over the dials like a captain inspecting his troops. My company stood trim and erect. Every needle was where it should be. I glanced down at the sea, and saw it bubbling under the steaming rain like a boiling cauldron. In a hydroplane this bumpy sea would have bothered me, but in this ship of mine, which could not possibly be set down here. I felt differently. It was silly, of course, but the thought gave me a sense of security. The sea was part of a world that I had nothing to do with. Engine trouble here was out of the question. There was not the least danger of such a thing. Why, I was not rigged for the sea. After an hour and a half of this, the rain died down, and though the clouds still hung low, a genial sun began to break through. I was immensely cheered by this promise of good weather. Overhead I could feel a thin layer of cotton wool, and I swerved aside to avoid a downpour. I was past the point where I had to cut through the hard squalls. Was not that the first rift in the cloud bank there ahead of me? I sensed it before I saw it, for straight ahead on the sea lay a long meadow-colored swath, a sort of oasis of deep and luminous green, reminding me of those barley fields in southern Morocco that would make me catch my breath each time I sighted them on coming up from Senegal across 2,000 miles of sand. Here, as at such times in Morocco, I felt we had reached a place where a man could live in, and it bucked me up. I flung a glance backward at Prévost and called out, "We're over the worst of it. This is fine." "Yes," he said. "Fine." This meant that I would not need to do any stunt flying when Sardinia hove unexpectedly into view. The island would not loom up suddenly like a mass of wreckage 100 feet ahead of me. I should be able to see it rising on the horizon in the distant play of 1,000 sparkling points of light. I moved into this region bathed by the sun. No doubt about it, I was loafing along, loafing at the rate of 170 miles an hour, but loafing nevertheless. I smoked a few leisurely cigarettes. I lingered over my coffee. I kept a cautious, fatherly eye on my brood of instruments. These clouds, this sun, this play of light, lent to my flight the relaxation of a Sunday afternoon stroll. The sea was as variegated as a country landscape broken into fields of green and violet and blue. Off in the distance, just where a squall was blowing, I could see the fermenting spray. Once again, I recognized that the sea was, of all things in the world, the least monotonous, was formed of an ever-changing substance. A gust of wind mantles it with light or strips it bare. I turned back to Prévost. "Look," I said. There, in the distance, lay the shores of Sardinia that we were about to skirt to the southward. Prévost came forward and sat down beside me. He squinted with wrinkled forehead at the mountains struggling out of their shroud of mist. The clouds had been blown away, and the island was coming into view in great slabs of field and woodland. I climbed to 4,500 feet and drifted along the coast of this island dotted with villages. After the flower-strewn but uninhabitable sea, this was a place where I could take things easily. For a little time I clung to our great hearted Mother Earth. Then, Sardinia behind me, I headed for Tunis. I picked up the African continent at Bizerte, and there I began to drop earthward. I was at home. Here was a place where I could dispense with altitude, which, as every pilot knows, is our particular store of wealth. Not that we squander it when it is no longer needed. We swap it for another kind of treasure. When a flyer is within a quarter of an hour of port, he sets his controls for the down swing, throttling his motor a little, just enough to keep it from racing while the needle on his speedometer swings round from 170 to 200 miles an hour. At that rate of speed, the impalpable eddies of evening air drum softly on the wings, and the plane seems to be drilling its way into a quivering crystal so delicate that the wake of a passing swallow would jar it to bits. I was already skirting the undulations of the hills, and had given away almost the whole of my few hundred feet of altitude when I reached the aerodrome, and there, shaving the roofs of the hangars, I set down my ship on the ground. While the tanks were being refilled, I signed some papers and shook hands with a few friends, and just as I was coming out of the administration building, I heard a horrible grunt, one of those muffled impacts that tell their fatal story in a single sound, one of those echoless thuds, complete in themselves, without appeal, in which fatality delivers its message. Instantly there came into my mind the memory of an identical sound, an explosion in a garage. 2 men had died of that horse-bark. I looked now across to the road that ran alongside the aerodrome. There, in a puff of dust, 2 high-powered cars had crashed head-on and stood frozen into motionless as if imprisoned in ice. Men were running towards the cars while others ran from them to the field office. "Get a doctor. Skull crushed." My heart sank. In the peace of the evening light, fate had taken a trick. A beauty, a mind, a life. Something had been destroyed. It was as sudden as a raid in the desert. Marauding tribesmen creep up on silent feet in the night. The camp resounds briefly with the clashing tumult of a racha. A moment later, everything has sunk back into the golden silence. The same peace, the same stillness followed this crash. Nearby, someone spoke of a fractured skull. I had no mind to be told about that crushed and bloody cranium. Turning my back to the road, I went across to my ship. In my heart, a foreboding of danger. I was to recognize that sound when I heard it again, very soon. When the Simoon scraped the Black Plateau at a speed of 170 miles an hour, I should recognize that hoarse grunt, that same snarl of destiny, keeping its appointment with us.